By 1944, the coast of occupied Europe was not merely a shoreline, it was a psychological and physical bastion, a monument to Nazi Germany's determination to turn the continent into an unassailable fortress. This was the Atlantic Wall, a term that evoked an image of a single, continuous, impenetrable barrier. In reality, it was a sprawling, complex, and often inconsistent network of defensive fortifications stretching from the northern tip of Norway to the Franco-Spanish border. But its power lay less in its concrete and steel, and more in the myth of its invincibility, a myth carefully cultivated by German propaganda and deeply ingrained in the minds of both the defenders and the awaiting Allied invaders. The wall was the brainchild of Adolf Hitler and executed under the relentless drive of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who took command of the defenses in late 1943. Rommel, having experienced the crushing superiority of Allied air power in North Africa, was a realist. He found the existing defenses woefully inadequate and embarked on a frantic building spree. His philosophy was simple: the invasion had to be defeated on the beaches themselves. The first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive, he famously stated. Under his direction, the coastline was transformed into a deadly obstacle course. Millions of mines were laid on the beaches and in the waters just offshore. Jagged, Czech hedgehogs, and massive Belgian gates of steel were erected to tear out the bottoms of landing craft. The beaches themselves were strewn with wooden stakes slanted seaward, many tipped with explosives. But the true teeth of the Atlantic Wall were its gun emplacements. These were not simple field artillery pieces, but massive, hardened fortifications designed to dominate the coastline. They ranged from smaller, rapid-fire anti-tank guns to colossal naval guns salvaged from battleships, with calibers of 150mm, 210mm, and even larger. These guns were housed in massive concrete casemates, some with walls up to 12 feet thick, reinforced with steel rebar. These bunkers were often interconnected by tunnels, complete with underground barracks, ammunition magazines, power generators, and command centers. They were designed to be self-sufficient fortresses, capable of weathering naval bombardment and air attack while continuing to pour fire onto the invasion beaches. Places like Pointe du Hoc in Normandy, with its 6 155mm guns poised to enfilade both Utah and Omaha beaches, became symbols of this defensive might. The German propaganda machine, led by Joseph Goebbels, worked tirelessly to amplify the wall's fearsome reputation. Newsreels showed seemingly endless lines of concrete being poured and massive guns being installed. They spoke of an iron curtain and a wall of fire that would annihilate any invasion force. This psychological warfare was aimed not only at discouraging the Allies but also at bolstering the morale of the German troops and the home front, convincing them that the West was secure while the Wehrmacht battled the Soviets in the East. For the Allied planners, the Atlantic Wall was a terrifying specter. Aerial reconnaissance photographs revealed a daunting landscape of fortifications. The sheer scale of the obstacle was paralyzing. The failed Canadian raid on Dieppe in 1942 had already provided a bloody lesson in the cost of assaulting a fortified port directly. The wall presented a seemingly unsolvable tactical problem. How could an amphibious force, vulnerable and disorganized during landing, possibly overcome fixed defenses manned by a determined enemy? Traditional field artillery would be useless in the initial assault. The guns would be at sea, unable to deploy and find their range against specific, hardened targets until it was too late. Naval gunfire, while powerful, was a blunt instrument. Battleships firing from miles out at sea struggled to achieve the pinpoint accuracy needed to destroy a single, well-camouflaged bunker aperture. Aerial bombardment was notoriously imprecise, and cloudy conditions could render it completely ineffective. The wall's defenses were designed to survive this initial storm of fire and then emerge to slaughter the infantry on the beaches. This created the core dilemma for the Allies. They needed a weapon that could deliver the power of a naval shell with the precision of a sniper rifle. They needed something that could be brought ashore after the initial landings, deployed under fire, and methodically dismantle the fortress Europe, bunker by bunker, pillbox by pillbox. The success of the entire invasion, and the future of the war in Europe, depended on solving this problem. The Atlantic Wall was not just a line of fortifications, it was a statement of German defensive doctrine. To break it, the Americans would need to make a statement of their own, one delivered not with tactical finesse, but with overwhelming, earth-shattering brute force. The myth of the wall's impenetrability would have to be shattered by the one weapon capable of speaking its language, the devastating, soul-crushing impact of a 240mm high-explosive shell. The stage was set for a confrontation between an immovable object and an unstoppable force. The Allied High Command's dilemma was as ancient as warfare itself, yet magnified by 20th-century engineering. How does an army on the offensive reduce a fixed, heavily fortified position? The Atlantic Wall was not a singular wall but a network of modern-day castles, their keeps made of reinforced concrete and their dragons represented by high-velocity artillery. Traditional methods of assault, infantry charges, mobile tank support, and even standard field artillery, were terrifyingly insufficient against these formidable structures. The problem demanded a specific, brutal solution, one that would force the U.S. Army to reach back through military history and resurrect a class of weapon it had largely neglected, the heavy siege gun. The fundamental challenge was physics. The German bunkers, designed to withstand direct hits from naval guns and aerial bombs, were constructed with layers of steel rebar and concrete several meters thick. A standard American 105mm howitzer shell would merely scorch and chip the surface, creating little more than a cloud of dust and concrete fragments. What was required was a projectile of immense mass, fired at a high trajectory, to plunge down onto the bunker's relatively thinner roof, or a shell with such mass and velocity that it could punch through the embrasure itself before detonating. This was not a task for field artillery, designed for mobility and suppressive fire, it was a task for a sledgehammer. Allied options were limited and fraught with drawbacks. Naval gunfire support, provided by battleships and cruisers, possessed the necessary power. A 16-inch shell from the USS Texas could obliterate any bunker it hit. However, naval gunfire was an imprecise tool for surgical destruction. Firing from a moving platform miles out at sea, often in poor weather, against a small, camouflaged target required near miraculous accuracy. It was excellent for area saturation and terrifying psychological effect, but it could not guarantee the destruction of a specific, stubborn strongpoint that was pinning down an infantry company on the beach. Aerial bombardment faced similar issues. While heavy bombers could deliver a cataclysmic payload, the technology for precision bombing in 1944 was still in its infancy. Cloud cover, anti-aircraft fire, and the simple difficulty of identifying a single bunker from thousands of feet in the air made it an unreliable solution. The collateral damage from near misses could also create new obstacles of craters and rubble, impeding the very advance the bombing was meant to enable. Furthermore, bombers could not loiter over a target, they delivered their payload and left. A bunker that survived the initial bombing run would continue its deadly work, and there was no guarantee the Air Force could return in time to silence it. This left ground-based artillery as the only viable answer. But the U.S. Army's standard divisional artillery, the 105mm and 155mm howitzers, lacked the sheer destructive power for the task. They could suppress the enemy, force them to keep their heads down, and target infantry in the open, but they could not destroy the fortification itself. What was needed was a weapon system that combined the pinpoint accuracy of field artillery, the survivability of a ground-based emplacement, and the raw, bunker-busting power of a naval shell. The Army needed a weapon that could be brought within visual range of its target, carefully aimed, and fire a projectile so powerful that a single direct hit would resolve the issue permanently. The solution lay in reviving a concept from the First World War, the heavy artillery regiment. The static, siege-like nature of trench warfare had led to the development and extensive use of massive howitzers on all sides. The American expeditionary forces had used French-made heavy guns, but in the interwar years, the U.S. Army, prioritizing mobility and the doctrine of a war of movement, had allowed its heavy artillery branch to atrophy. The coming war in Europe, against an enemy known for building formidable defensive lines like the Siegfried Line and the Atlantic Wall, signaled a critical need to correct this oversight. The problem was not just one of weapon design, but of doctrine and logistics. A siege gun is not a tactical weapon. It is a strategic asset that moves at a glacial pace, requires Herculean effort to emplace, and consumes vast quantities of specialized ammunition. Its crew is not a small, mobile team, but a small company of men dedicated to the service of a single weapon. Deploying such a system in the fluid, fast-moving environment the Allies hoped to create after D-Day seemed like a contradiction. Yet, the hard lessons of Italy, where German mountain fortifications had caused massive Allied casualties, proved that without such tools, the campaign in Europe would degenerate into a bloody, grinding crawl. Their siege gun problem was therefore a multifaceted challenge. It was a tactical problem of how to destroy a specific type of target. It was an industrial problem of designing and building a weapon capable of the task. It was a logistical problem of transporting dozens of 25-ton guns and their ammunition across the ocean and then through the wreckage of the European battlefield. And finally, it was a doctrinal problem of integrating these slow, methodical behemoths into an army built for speed. The Americans needed a concrete cracker, a fortress killer, a weapon that could look a German bunker in the eye and blow it to pieces. The answer was already taking shape in American factories: the 240mm Howitzer M1, a weapon designed for one simple, brutal purpose: to reduce concrete giants to rubble. The answer to the concrete giants of the Atlantic Wall was forged not on a European battlefield, but in the drawing rooms of American arsenals and the fiery hearts of its steel mills. The 240mm Howitzer M1 was not a weapon born of panic, but of prescient planning. Its development was a slow, deliberate process that began before the United States even entered the war, a testament to the foresight of military planners who understood that the next conflict would inevitably involve the reduction of massive fortifications. The birth of this colossal weapon was a masterpiece of American industrial engineering, a fusion of brute force and intricate mechanics designed to deliver a singular, war-ending statement. The genesis of the 240mm Howitzer can be traced back to the lessons of World War I. The grueling, static siege warfare of the Western Front had demonstrated the critical need for heavy, high-trajectory artillery capable of destroying deep bunkers and fortified positions. While the U.S. Army had relied on French-made heavy guns like the 240mm Schneider in that conflict, the interwar period saw a determined effort to develop a Native American design. The project, however, languished in the era of budget cuts and isolationism. It was the rise of Hitler's Germany and its construction of the West Wall, known to the Allies as the Siegfried Line, that injected new urgency into the program. By the late 1930s, the U.S. Army Ordnance Department had revived the designs, and the Watervliet Arsenal in New York began the meticulous work of turning blueprints into steel. The engineering challenges were monumental. This was not merely a scaled-up 155mm howitzer. Firing a 360-pound, 163 kilograms, high-explosive projectile required a massive, reinforced barrel capable of withstanding immense internal pressures. The carriage had to be robust enough to handle the titanic recoil forces without disintegrating, yet designed with some consideration for mobility, or at least, transportability. The solution was a complex two-part system. The howitzer itself, the barrel and breech, was one component. The massive, box-tracked carriage, which looked more like that of a tank than a field gun, was the other. For travel, the barrel would be detached and hauled on a separate heavy trailer, while the carriage moved under its own power or was towed. This cumbersome process was the necessary trade-off for achieving the required firepower. The statistics of the M1 were as awe-inspiring as its physical presence. The entire system weighed over 64,000 pounds, 29 tons. Its 240mm, 9.45-inch, barrel could hurl its 360-pound projectile over 14 miles, 23 kilometers. But its true genius lay not in its range, but in the ballistic arc of its shell. Fired at a high angle, the shell would travel high into the air before plunging almost vertically onto its target. This plunging fire was the key to defeating fortifications. While a bunker's walls might be 12 feet thick, its roof was often a more vulnerable point. A 240mm shell arriving from directly above could smash through reinforced concrete and detonate inside the structure, turning the fortified space into a tomb. The shell's massive blast radius, over 50 yards, could also destroy any unhardened infrastructure, command posts, ammunition dumps, artillery batteries, positioned near the main fortification. The manufacturing process was a symphony of American heavy industry. The massive steel forgings for the barrel came from specialized foundries, machined to microscopic tolerances at Watervliet. Their complex recoil mechanisms and elevation gears were precision-engineered sub-assemblies. The carriage was a feat of structural engineering. This was not a weapon that could be produced on an automobile assembly line. It was built with the care and precision of a capital ship, each one a custom piece of artillery art. Production was slow and methodical, but by 1943, the first models were rolling out, destined for the toughest fronts where American infantry was facing the worst of German defensive ingenuity. The very existence of the 240mm Howitzer M1 signaled a fundamental shift in American military doctrine. It was an admission that for all the talk of blitzkrieg and mobile warfare, some problems could only be solved with overwhelming, deliberate, and localized force. It was the antithesis of the German 88mm gun, a versatile dual-purpose weapon. The 240mm had one purpose, one mission: to destroy what other guns could not. It was a specialist, a master of a single, brutal trade. As the first units were allocated to specialized heavy artillery battalions, the crews began their own arduous training. Manning the 240mm was not like serving on a standard howitzer. It required a team of over a dozen men just to prepare the gun for firing. The process of emplacing the weapon, leveling the massive carriage, assembling the firing platform, and remating the barrel, could take hours. This was not a weapon for a rapid advance, it was a weapon for methodical, unstoppable destruction. As these guns were crated and loaded onto ships bound for the European and Mediterranean theaters, they carried with them the promise of a new kind of American power. The 240mm howitzer was not just a new piece of equipment, it was a statement. The concrete giants of Fortress Europe had been measured, and America had forged the hammer to break them. The 240mm Howitzer M1 was a masterpiece of destructive engineering, but its very power created an immense and often overlooked challenge: mobility. A weapon system weighing over 27 tons was not merely transported, it was a logistical operation in itself. Before the massive shell could ever scream towards a German bunker, the howitzer had to win its first battle, a battle against distance, terrain, and the laws of physics. The journey of the 240mm from the marshalling yards of England to the firing positions of Normandy and beyond was a saga of ingenuity, brute force, and sheer determination, proving that deploying such a colossal weapon was as complex as building it. The challenge began at the most fundamental level. The 240mm was not a single piece of equipment. For transport, it was broken down into two primary loads: the massive barrel assembly, weighing over 13 tons, and the carriage and firing platform, weighing another 14 tons. Each of these required its own dedicated M6 heavy artillery tractor, a powerful and rugged vehicle specifically designed for such Herculean tasks. These tractors, essentially heavy trucks built with tank-like components, were the only land vehicles capable of hauling the howitzer's components at any speed beyond a crawl. Even with these specialized vehicles, movement was a deliberate, painstaking process. The first major obstacle was the sea. Loading the disassembled howitzer and its tractors onto landing ships was a delicate ballet of cranes and sweat. Once across the channel, the real test began on the beaches of Normandy. In the days and weeks following D-Day, the beaches were a chaotic nightmare of congestion, with every piece of equipment for an entire army fighting for space on the narrow exits. A 27-ton artillery piece was a logistical nightmare in this environment. It could not be manhandled. It could not be quickly moved if it got stuck. It was a giant, immovable object in a sea of frantic motion. Specialist units, like the 269th Field Artillery Battalion, faced these conditions head-on. Moving the 240mm off the beach and into a hiding position required finding routes that could support its immense weight. A standard pontoon bridge or a hastily repaired road was often insufficient. The engineers had to identify and reinforce paths, often under the threat of enemy shelling. The movement of a single 240mm battery was a major operation, requiring coordination with military police to clear routes and with engineers to assure the integrity of the ground. They moved mostly at night, their massive silhouettes and the deep roar of their tractors betraying their presence, making stealth impossible. Once inland, the process of emplacing the gun was a ritual that could take a full day. A suitable firing position had to be found, a location with a stable, firm base and clear routes for ammunition resupply. The site was then prepared. The carriage was backed into position and carefully leveled. The massive firing platform, a steel grid that would absorb and distribute the tremendous recoil, was laid down. Then, using a built-in winch and the labor of every man in the crew, the 13-ton barrel was painstakingly lifted from its transport trailer and carefully mated to the carriage. It was a procedure that required precision and immense physical strength, a constant battle against gravity and inertia. A single mistake could damage the delicate elevation gears or, worse, crush a crew member. The ammunition supply was a logistical chain in itself. The 360-pound high-explosive projectiles and their separate powder charges were not handled like standard artillery rounds. Each shell was moved using a special hoist and cart. A single battery firing a sustained mission required a constant convoy of trucks bringing up these monstrous shells from the rear depots. The crewmen, who were artillerymen by trade, spent as much time as laborious, moving the heavy shells from truck to hoist to breech. The act of loading the weapon was a deliberate, two-man process, a far cry from the rapid-fire drill of a 105mm Howitzer crew. This colossal effort meant that the 240mm was not a responsive weapon. It could not be quickly displaced to support a rapidly advancing infantry unit. It was a strategic asset, deployed to tackle the most formidable obstacles on the battlefield. Its movement was planned days in advance. When a division encountered a fortress that had stopped its advance cold, the request would go up the chain of command. The word would be passed to the heavy artillery battalion, a target worthy of the monster had been found. Then the slow, deliberate process would begin again, dismantling, moving, and reassembling the beast, a ritual performed to bring a specific, localized apocalypse to the enemy. The 240mm Howitzer did not just arrive at the front, it was projected there, a testament to the unyielding will of the American logistical system to deliver overwhelming force to exactly where it was needed, no matter the cost or effort. The theoretical power of the 240mm Howitzer was proven not on the flat sands of a stateside testing range, but in the jagged, brutal mountains of Italy. Here, the Allied advance had stalled against the Germans' masterfully constructed defensive lines, the Gustav Line, anchored on the ancient monastery of Monte Cassino, and the subsequent Hitler Line. These were not simple beachfront bunkers, they were deep, interlocking networks of fortifications built into the very rock of the Apennines, designed to inflict maximum casualties and bleed the Allies white. It was in this hellish landscape of mud, stone, and steel that the 240mm Howitzer received its baptism by fire, its deep-throated roar announcing a new era of American siege warfare. The campaign in Italy had become a grim, grinding battle of attrition. German paratroopers and panzergrenadiers occupied positions on high ground, their observation posts granting them perfect views of the valleys below. Their artillery was pre-registered on every approach. Their machine gun nests were carved into reverse slopes, immune to direct fire. Standard American 105mm and 155mm artillery could suppress these positions, but could not destroy them. The shells would blast the surrounding landscape, but the reinforced concrete and stone emplacements would often remain intact, their crews emerging once the barrage lifted to continue their deadly work. The infantry, attacking uphill against these positions, were paying a horrific price. The first 240mm Howitzers arrived in the Italian theater in early 1944, assigned to a handful of heavy artillery battalions. Their initial deployment was a logistical nightmare. The mountainous terrain was the antithesis of what the massive weapon needed. Narrow, winding roads, often turned to quagmires by rain, had to be negotiated by the heavy artillery tractors hauling their colossal loads. Finding stable, level firing positions was a constant challenge for the battery commanders. Yet, the sheer desperation of the tactical situation demanded their use. The Allies needed a weapon that could do what bombs and standard shells could not: reach out and obliterate a specific, hardened target with a single, definitive blow. The first targets were the most formidable strongpoints of the Hitler Line. These were not simple pillboxes, but complex, multi-story concrete bunkers housing 75mm and 88mm guns, their walls thick enough to deflect anything short of a direct hit from a battleship's main battery. When a 240mm shell was finally fired in anger, the effect was seismic. Observers reported not just an explosion, but a cataclysm. The shell's high, arcing trajectory allowed it to plunge down onto the fortifications. A direct hit would not just damage a bunker, it would eviscerate it. The massive blast would crack reinforced concrete like an eggshell, collapse internal structures, and often trigger secondary explosions as the bunker's own ammunition stores detonated. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction. For the German defenders, the arrival of the 240mm shell was a new and terrifying experience. They were accustomed to artillery barrages, but this was different. This was a single, colossal detonation that could erase an entire position from the map in an instant. There was no warning whistle that grew into a shriek. The shell was so large and moving so relatively slowly that its sound in flight was a deep, ominous rumble, like an approaching freight train. The defenders would hear this rumble, knowing it was meant for them, and then the world would explode. The sound of the impact alone, a deep, percussive crump that could be felt in the chest from miles away, became a weapon of terror. For the Allied infantry, particularly the multinational forces preparing to assault the German lines, the sound of the 240mm was a morale booster of incalculable value. After weeks and months of being pinned down by unassailable positions, they now witnessed concrete giants being methodically dismantled. They could see the plumes of dust and debris erupting from the mountain sides, knowing that each one represented the death of a strongpoint that had cost the lives of their comrades. It gave them a tangible belief that their high command finally possessed a tool capable of breaking the stalemate. The 240mm's performance at Monte Cassino and in the Liri Valley, while not single-handedly winning the battle, proved its worth beyond any doubt. It demonstrated that no German fortification was truly safe. It could destroy observation posts on the most inaccessible peaks, silence artillery emplacements thought to be invulnerable, and collapse reinforced command bunkers. The lessons learned in Italy were invaluable. They refined the deployment techniques, improved the logistical chains, and, most importantly, forged the crews into veteran teams who understood the unique power and limitations of their weapon. Their baptism by fire in the Italian mountains was a brutal but necessary proving ground. When the Howitzers and their seasoned crews were redeployed for the invasion of northern France, they were no longer an untested novelty. They were a battle-hardened, confident force, ready to bring their particular brand of earth-shattering justice to the fortresses of the Atlantic Wall. The monster had tasted blood, and it was hungry for more. The success of the D-Day landings on June 6, 1944, was a monumental achievement, but it was merely the breaching of the Atlantic Wall's outer gate. As the Allied forces pushed inland from the beaches, they immediately encountered the true, deeply layered nature of German defenses. The initial, frantic battle for survival on the sand gave way to a new, more grueling phase of combat, the bloody, yard-by-yard struggle against a network of fortified positions that turned the Norman countryside into a deadly labyrinth. This was the bunker stalemate, a period where Allied momentum threatened to evaporate completely, strangled by a resilient enemy who understood that his survival depended on making the Allies pay for every hedgerow, every village, and every crossroad. The terrain itself became the Germans' greatest ally. The bocage, a centuries-old patchwork of small fields surrounded by dense, towering hedgerows growing atop massive earthen berms, was a defender's paradise. Each hedgerow was a natural fortification, a wall of earth and roots that could conceal machine gun nests, mortar teams, and snipers. Tanks could not penetrate them, and infantry advancing across an open field would be cut down by interlocking fields of fire from the flanks. The Germans had spent years integrating their man-made fortifications into this natural fortress. Concrete pillboxes were sited to cover the narrow country lanes, their fields of fire perfectly pre-registered. Larger strongpoints, often based in the stout stone buildings of Norman villages, were fortified with bunkers, trenches, and camouflaged anti-tank guns. The initial Allied push, particularly by the American V Corps at Omaha Beach and the 7 Corps at Utah, quickly lost its momentum in the face of this determined and cleverly deployed resistance. The advance, measured in hundreds of yards per day, was excruciatingly slow and costly. The U.S. 29th Infantry Division, fighting its way inland from Omaha, found itself bogged down in a brutal fight for the town of St. Lo, a key transportation hub that became a symbol of the stalemate. Every attack was met with a storm of fire from positions that seemed immune to destruction. Standard Allied tools were proving inadequate. The Sherman tank, while reliable and numerous, was vulnerable to the German Panzerfaust and well-hidden anti-tank guns in the close confines of the blockage. Field artillery, the traditional king of battle, was frustrated. The 105mm and 155mm howitzers could blast the hedgerows, but they often failed to destroy the reinforced German positions hidden within and behind them. A barrage would lift, and the German defenders would emerge from their deep dugouts to man their weapons, cutting down the advancing American infantry. The fighting devolved into a brutal, close-quarters nightmare of grenades, bayonets, and flamethrowers. This was the precise tactical problem the 240mm howitzer was designed to solve, but in the immediate aftermath of D-Day, the colossal weapons were nowhere to be seen. They were still aboard ships or struggling through the nightmarish congestion of the invasion beaches. The logistical priority was for ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements, the essentials needed to simply maintain the fragile beachhead. The slow, methodical, and resource-intensive process of landing, assembling, and deploying the 240mm batteries was a luxury the Allies could not yet afford. The front was too fluid, the supply lines too tenuous. For the German commanders, this stalemate was a vindication of their defensive doctrine. They had always believed that even if the Allies secured a beachhead, they could be contained and bled dry in the blockage. They watched with satisfaction as the powerful Allied war machine, for all its supposed mobility and material superiority, was reduced to a bloody crawl. They knew that time was their enemy, as Allied buildup was inevitable, but they hoped to make the cost of breaking out so high that it would fracture Allied morale and political will. For the American soldier on the ground, this period was one of supreme frustration and terror. They could feel the opportunity for a rapid breakout slipping away. They were dying for patches of ground that, on a map, seemed insignificant. They knew the Germans were dug in, and they knew their own artillery, for all its volume, couldn't dig them out. There was a desperate need for a game-changer, a weapon that could shatter the stalemate not with volume, but with overwhelming, localized power. The infantry needed a sledgehammer to crack the toughest nuts, a weapon that could look at a concrete pillbox that had survived a dozen artillery barrages and simply erase it from existence. The stage was set for the arrival of the heavy artillery. The stalemate in the blockage created a specific and urgent demand for the 240mm howitzer's unique capabilities. The call went out from frustrated division and corps commanders: they needed the bunker busters. The slow, arduous process of bringing the 240mm batteries into action began in earnest. As the first of these giants were carefully emplaced behind the lines, their long, sleek barrels pointing towards the German strongpoints around Saint-Lô and Corentin, a new sound was about to be introduced to the battlefield, a sound that would signal the end of the stalemate and the beginning of the methodical destruction of Fortress Europe. By late July 1944, the Normandy front had congealed into a bloody, stagnant mess. The Allied advance, particularly that of the U.S. First Army, was measured in yards and paid for with thousands of casualties in the treacherous blockage country. The strategic key to breaking this deadlock was the city of Saint-Lô, a vital road nexus now reduced to rubble by weeks of fighting. Operation Cobra, the plan for the American breakout, was General Omar Bradley's masterstroke. It called for an unprecedented concentration of aerial bombardment to pulverize a narrow section of the German front west of Saint-Lô, creating a gap through which 7 corps armored and infantry divisions could pour, finally escaping their confining hedgerows. But the planners knew that bombs alone might not be enough. For the first time in the European theater, the 240mm howitzer would be unleashed as an integral part of the offensive, its mission to perform the surgical strikes that bombers could not. The days leading up to July 25, D-Day for Cobra, were a frenzy of activity for the heavy artillery battalions. The 240mm batteries were painstakingly emplaced in carefully selected positions, their massive components having been hauled from the beaches and assembled under the cover of darkness. Their targets were not general area targets, but specific, high-value fortifications that intelligence had identified within the Cobra corridor. These were the linchpins of the German defense: command bunkers, reinforced artillery observation posts, and communication centers that had survived the previous weeks of fighting. If these nodes survived the aerial onslaught, they could quickly coordinate a lethal defense, calling down artillery on the advancing American columns and stalling the breakout before it began. When the morning of July 25 arrived, it began with a cataclysm from the air. Over 1,500 heavy bombers and hundreds of medium bombers and fighter bombers unloaded a torrent of high explosives onto the Panzer-led division and other German units holding the line. The earth trembled for miles. From their positions, the crews of the 240mm Howitzers watched the horizon vanish behind a rolling cloud of dust, smoke, and debris. But as the last bombers departed, a more deliberate, methodical symphony of destruction began. This was the moment for their concrete crackers. While the frontline 105mm and 155mm artillery laid down a suppressing barrage, the 240mm Howitzers went to work. Their mission was one of precision demolition. Through the lingering dust, forward observers, positioned in risky vantage points, identified targets that had survived the bombing. A specific command bunker, its radio antenna still standing. A reinforced farmhouse serving as a strong point. A well-camouflaged anti-tank gun emplacement. The coordinates were radioed back to the fire direction center. Then came the sound that would become synonymous with doom for the German defenders in the Cobra sector, the deep, resonating boom of the 240mm howitzer, distinct from the sharper crack of smaller artillery. The shell's flight was not a scream, but a low, freight train rumble that grew in intensity until it ended in an apocalyptic detonation. A direct hit on a target was not merely an explosion, it was a localized earthquake. Reinforced concrete structures, which had shrugged off countless smaller shells, disintegrated. Earthen fortifications were simply vaporized, leaving behind vast craters. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. For the Germans, already reeling from the traumatic bombing, the 240mm fire was a final, unbearable pressure. There was no defense against it. A soldier could survive in a deep bunker during a standard artillery barrage, but a direct hit from a 360-pound high-explosive shell would obliterate the bunker and everyone in it. The relentless, pinpoint accuracy of these massive shells systematically dismantled the command and control structure of the German units in the path of the American spearhead. For the American infantry and tank crews waiting to jump off, the sight of the 240mm's work was a powerful boost to morale. They watched as formidable obstacles that had plagued them for weeks were methodically erased from the landscape. It gave them the confidence to press the attack, knowing that the most hardened resistance had been dealt with by a weapon of unparalleled power. The success of Operation Cobra was the 240mm howitzer's definitive European debut. It proved that the weapon was not a cumbersome relic, but a vital component of modern combined arms warfare. It had provided the crucial, surgical power needed to complement the area saturation of the aerial bombardment. By silencing key strongpoints that the bombers had missed, the 240mm batteries helped clear the path for the armored divisions that burst through the German line. The breakout they enabled would lead to the liberation of Brittany and the eventual encirclement of the German army at Falaise. The stalemate was broken. The 240mm howitzer had arrived, and its deep-throated roar would now echo across France, heralding the methodical end of Fortress Europe. The breakout from Normandy and the headlong rush across France created a new and dangerous problem for the Allies, bypassed German garrisons holding critical port cities. The most formidable of these was Brest, a heavily fortified deepwater port on the tip of the Brittany Peninsula. Held by the fanatical German 2nd Parachute Corps under the command of the ruthless General Hermann Bernhard Ramker, Brest was a fortress city in the truest sense. Its defenses were a nightmare of modern and ancient fortifications, incorporating thick medieval stone walls, sprawling underground tunnels, and state-of-the-art concrete bunkers and gun emplacements built by the German Navy. Reducing Brest would require not a battle of maneuver, but a brutal, set-piece siege, the perfect, hellish proving ground for the 240mm howitzer. The US 8 Corps, tasked with capturing the port, quickly realized that standard tactics were useless. The outer defenses were a complex web of trenches, minefields, and mutually supporting strongpoints. Behind them lay the inner ring of forts, including concrete U-boat pens that were virtually immune to aerial bombardment. The German paratroopers within were elite, motivated, and prepared to fight to the last man. They used the labyrinth of medieval cellars and modern tunnels to move reinforcements and supplies, popping up to launch devastating counterattacks before disappearing back into the subterranean world. The initial American assaults were repulsed with heavy losses. It became clear that Brest would not fall to infantry courage alone. Its defenses had to be physically dismantled, stone by concrete stone. This was the moment the 240mm Howitzer transitioned from a supporting weapon to the star of the show. The siege of Brest became an artilleryman's war, and the 240mm was the king. The howitzers were painstakingly moved into positions, often within plain sight of the city's outer walls. The concept of a rear area was meaningless. The entire front was a swirling cauldron of mortar and sniper fire. Emplacing the massive guns was a deadly endeavor, but once in position, they began a methodical, terrifying bombardment. The 240mm's role at Brest was one of point-blank demolition. The gunners were no longer firing at distant coordinates, they were engaging specific structures they could see through their optics. Their targets were the very pillars of Brest's defense, the thick medieval gates that barred entry to the old city, the reinforced concrete observation bunkers perched on the cliffs, the naval gun casemates with their steel-shuttered embrasures. One by one, the giants of the 240mm were tasked with destroying these giants of concrete. The effect was both physically destructive and psychologically shattering. A medieval gate that had stood for centuries, which had repelled cannon fire in ages past, would vanish in a single cataclysmic blast, leaving only a gaping hole and a pile of dust. A direct hit on a concrete observation bunker would not just damage it, the structure would seem to momentarily swell before collapsing inward upon itself, its occupants entombed. The German defenders, hardened veterans though they were, had never experienced anything like it. They could endure the shrapnel of field artillery, but there was no enduring the 240mm shell. Its arrival was not a warning, it was a death sentence for anyone in or near its target. The American infantry, bogged down in a costly street-by-street, house-by-house battle, came to rely on the 240mm as their ultimate problem solver. When a particular strong point, a fortified school, a barricaded city block, a stubborn sniper's nest in a stone tower, halted the advance, the call would go out. The forward observer would radio the coordinates, and after a tense wait, the deep-throated roar of the 240mm would answer. The infantry would watch as the building simply ceased to exist, replaced by a cloud of pulverized brick and mortar. Then they would advance, moving through the crater that marked the grave of their opposition. The siege dragged on for over a month, a brutal and costly affair. But throughout it, the 240mm howitzers maintained their relentless, methodical work. They were the great equalizers, turning the Germans' greatest asset, their fortifications, into death traps. The final surrender of Brest on September 19, 1944, was a testament to the grim effectiveness of this new American way of siege warfare. The port itself was rendered useless, its facilities destroyed by the Germans and the Allied bombardment, but the strategic lesson was indelible. The 240mm howitzer had proven it could reduce any man-made structure to rubble, no matter how ancient or modern, no matter how thick its walls. The fall of Brest sent a clear message to every other German garrison holding out in a fortified port: resistance was futile. The Americans possessed a key that could unlock any fortress, and its name was the 240mm Howitzer M1. The heady days of the pursuit across France ended abruptly in September 1944 at the German border. Here, the advancing Allied armies confronted a sight that evoked both ancient mythology and modern industrial warfare: the Siegfried Line, or West Wall. This was not a single wall, but a deep, integrated defensive zone stretching hundreds of miles. Its most iconic feature was their dragon's teeth, rows of pyramidal concrete anti-tank obstacles designed to channel attacking armor into pre-sighted killing zones. But the teeth were merely the forward lip of a monstrous mouth. Behind them lay a nightmarish landscape of pillboxes, command bunkers, interlocking trench systems, and fortified villages, all woven into the dense forests and rolling hills of western Germany. For the American infantry and armor, this was the gateway to the Reich, and it was guarded by a determined enemy fighting on home soil. To break through, they would need to summon the heaviest tool in their arsenal once more. The initial attempts to penetrate the Siegfried Line were bloody and frustrating. The First Army's V Corps ran into a buzzsaw at the Hurtgen Forest, where the dense woods negated American advantages in mobility and air power, turning the battle into a brutal, First World War-style meat grinder. Further south, Patton's Third Army found the approaches to the Saar region similarly fortified. Sherman tanks were helpless against the Dragon's Teeth, and infantry assaults on pillboxes were cut down by interlocking machine gun fire. The German defenders, a mix of weary veterans and fresh, fanatical Volkssturm militia, fought with a desperation born from defending their homeland. The Allied advance, which had flowed so freely across France, solidified into a stagnant, costly line. It was in this stalemate that the 240mm Howitzer found its ultimate purpose. Their weapon, so effective against the discreet fortifications of Brest, was now tasked with systematically dismantling an entire defensive system. The process was methodical and brutally straightforward. The howitzers were emplaced, often under enemy artillery fire, just beyond the effective range of the German defense's primary armament. Their mission was to conduct counterfortification warfare, the deliberate, piecemeal destruction of the Siegfried Line's strongest points. The 240mm's high, plunging fire was perfectly suited to the task. A German pillbox, designed to withstand frontal assault and standard artillery, was vulnerable from above. A single 360-pound shell landing directly on its roof would crack it open like an egg. The massive explosion would collapse the interior, kill the crew, and often cause the ammunition stored inside to detonate, finishing the job. Observers reported seeing entire pillboxes lifted from the ground by the force of the blast, only to collapse into a pile of rubble. The concrete Dragon's Teeth, while immune to tank guns, could be shattered and displaced by near misses, creating breaches for engineers to clear and for tanks to finally pass. The psychological impact on the German defenders was profound. For weeks, they had held the Americans at bay, confident in the strength of their concrete walls. The arrival of the 240mm shells shattered that confidence. There was no tactical response to such firepower. A soldier could be brave, he could be a crack shot, but he was powerless inside a bunker that was suddenly turning into his tomb. The deep, unmistakable rumble of an incoming 240mm round became a sound that heralded certain doom. Defenders began to abandon their posts at the first sign of the howitzers' targeting, preferring to take their chances in the open rather than be buried alive. The American infantry, who had been pinned down for weeks, watched this systematic demolition with a sense of grim satisfaction. The 240mm was their master key, unlocking the gates of Germany one shattered bunker at a time. A battalion stalled by a particular strongpoint would call in the heavy artillery. After a few earth-shattering rounds, the resistance would cease. The infantry could then advance, not through a hail of gunfire, but through the dust and silence of a destroyed position. The howitzers enabled a new tactic. Instead of costly frontal assaults, the Americans could now mousehole their way through the Siegfried Line, using the 240mm to blast a path, then pouring infantry and tanks through the gap to attack the next line of defenses from the flank and rear. The breaching of the Siegfried Line was not a single event, but a campaign of attrition fought with sledgehammers. Throughout the autumn and winter of 1944, the 240mm howitzers hammered away at the German west wall. They destroyed observation posts that had directed deadly accurate artillery fire. They silenced fortified 88mm gun positions that had dominated key roads. They collapsed command bunkers, decapitating German local leadership. Each destroyed strongpoint was a link broken in the defensive chain. The fall of the Siegfried Line was the cumulative result of this relentless, concrete cracking pressure. The Dragon's Teeth, designed to stop the blitzkrieg, were powerless against the deliberate, earth-shaking blows of the American siege guns. The path into the heart of Germany was being punched open, not with speed, but with overwhelming, unstoppable force. The 240mm howitzer was more than a weapon of physical destruction, it was a profound psychological instrument. Its impact transcended the craters it carved and the bunkers it vaporized, reaching deep into the mind of the enemy. On the battlefields of Europe, a new and terrifying lexicon of sound was introduced, one that bypassed rational thought and triggered primal fear. For the German soldier, the 240mm shell became the audible manifestation of inevitability, a slow, rumbling announcement of death that could not be outrun, hidden from, or reasoned with. This chapter is not about the destruction of concrete, but the shattering of morale. The auditory signature of the 240mm was unique and horrifyingly distinct from any other weapon on the battlefield. The firing of the gun itself was a deep, chest-compressing boom that echoed for miles, a sound that demanded attention. But the true psychological weapon was the shell in flight. Smaller artillery shells traveled faster than sound, their arrival preceded by a sudden, sharp scream or whistle that gave defenders a split second to dive for cover. The 240mm shell was different. Due to its immense size and weight, it traveled at a slower, subsonic velocity. This created a terrifying acoustic phenomenon. Defenders could hear it coming for several seconds before impact. The sound was not a scream, but a low, building rumble, like an approaching freight train or distant thunder that grew steadily and inexorably louder. It was a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating through the ground and in the bones of the men who heard it. For those in its path, these were the longest seconds of their lives. It was a period of agonizing anticipation, a countdown to oblivion where a soldier was forced to confront his own mortality, utterly powerless to change his fate. There was no duck and cover. If the shell had your name on it, you were already dead, you just had to wait for the delivery. This sound had a corrosive effect on German unit cohesion and fighting spirit. A position could withstand hours of conventional shelling. Men would hunker in their bunkers, enduring the noise and shock, emerging when the barrage lifted to man their weapons. But the 240mm changed this calculus. A single round could mean the end of the entire position. Soldiers reported a peculiar form of paralysis setting in when they heard the rumble. They would freeze, listening, trying to discern if the sound was coming for them or passing to a neighboring unit. The relief when a shell detonated a few hundred meters away was immediately replaced by the dread of hearing the next one fired, knowing the gunners were methodically walking their fire across the defense line. The phenomenon of bunker shock became prevalent among German troops manning fortified positions, the very men who were supposed to be the most secure. Knowing that their thick concrete walls, their primary source of security, were now merely a target for a shell designed specifically to obliterate them created a deep-seated sense of vulnerability. Stories spread through the ranks of bunkers being found intact from the outside, their gun slits silent, but with the interior turned into a charnel house, the crew killed by the concussive force alone without a single crack in the concrete. This was a fear that logic could not dispel. Forward observers and infantrymen on the American side began to note the psychological aftermath. They would advance into positions recently shelled by the 240mm to find survivors in a state of catatonic shock, their fighting spirit completely broken. Interrogations of prisoners revealed a specific dread of the slow-firing heavy gun or the Amerikanische Bunkernacker, the American bunkerbuster. German after-action reports frequently mentioned the demoralizing effect of the 24cm Haubitze, noting that its fire often prompted the abandonment of positions without a direct infantry assault. The 240mm Howitzer, therefore, achieved its objective even when it missed. The constant threat of its arrival forced German commanders to constantly rotate troops from the front lines to prevent morale from collapsing entirely. It disrupted sleep, sowed paranoia, and made soldiers trigger-happy and exhausted. In the calculus of war, a weapon that can break the enemy's will to fight is as valuable as one that destroys his material. The 240mm was a master of both. Its deep-throated roar became the soundtrack of American inevitability, a sound that told every German soldier on the Western Front that there was no fortress strong enough, no defense deep enough, to save them from the industrial might of the United States. It was the sound of the Reich itself, cracking under the strain. The final collapse of Nazi Germany in May 1945 was the result of countless factors: the relentless Soviet advance from the east, the strategic bombing campaign that crippled war production, the bravery of infantrymen in 1,000 battles, and the overwhelming logistical power of the Allies. Yet, in the specific, brutal narrative of the ground war in Western Europe, one weapon came to symbolize the inexorable, crushing weight of American industrial might applied directly to the enemy's strongest points. The 240mm Howitzer did not just participate in the final campaigns, it fundamentally shaped them, proving itself as the true king of battle, whose authority even the most fanatical German defense could not challenge. As the Allies crossed the Rhine in early 1945 and drove into the heart of Germany, the nature of the fighting changed, but the need for the 240mm's unique capabilities did not diminish. The German army, though shattered and in retreat, fought with a desperate ferocity on home soil. They used ancient towns, industrial complexes, and river lines as natural fortifications. Cities like Cologne, Nuremberg, and the industrial heartland of the Ruhr became veritable fortresses, defended by a mix of seasoned SS troops, army regulars, and Hitler Youth convinced by Nazi propaganda of the barbarism of the invading Allies. Reducing these urban strongholds would have been a prohibitively costly endeavor without a tool like the 240mm Howitzer. In the final months of the war, the howitzer's role evolved from a siege weapon to a precision demolition tool. In the dense urban environment, German resistance often crystallized around specific, formidable structures: a medieval castle converted into a command post, a massive flak tower, a reinforced concrete factory, or a stone bridge that needed to be destroyed to block an Allied crossing. Standard artillery could turn a city into rubble, but it often failed to destroy the key strongpoint hidden within the general destruction. The 240mm was the solution. A forward observer would identify the building housing the German headquarters or the key defensive strongpoint. The coordinates would be relayed, and a single 240mm shell, or a carefully placed volley, would be fired. The result was not just the destruction of a building, but the decapitation of the local German command or the elimination of a linchpin in the defensive scheme. The psychological impact, detailed in the previous chapter, reached its zenith in these final battles. For the German soldier, the choice became stark: surrender or be annihilated by a force against which there was no defense. The 240mm shell became the ultimate argument for surrender. White flags would frequently appear from positions that had just been targeted or were about to be targeted by the heavy howitzers. German commanders, in their final communications, often cited the devastating effect of the enemy's super-heavy artillery as a primary reason for the collapse of their defensive sectors. They could devise countermeasures for tanks, they could ambush infantry, but they had no answer for a shell that could vaporize their command bunker from miles away. The 240mm's contribution to forcing Germany's surrender was not measured in territory captured, but in the systematic dismantling of the enemy's will and ability to resist in fortified positions. It shattered the foundational German defensive doctrine that had sustained them from the Atlantic Wall to the Siegfried Line, the belief that fortified positions could delay, attrite, and ultimately stop an advancing enemy. The 240mm howitzer proved this doctrine obsolete. No fortification was safe. This realization seeped into the highest levels of the German command. If a bunker was not a sanctuary but a potential tomb, and if every key defensive point could be systematically obliterated, then prolonged resistance was not just futile, but suicidal. Furthermore, the weapon demonstrated a key facet of American military philosophy that ultimately won the war: the fusion of mass production and specialized excellence. The United States built thousands of reliable, standardized Sherman tanks and trucks, but it also had the industrial depth and technical skill to produce a small number of these exquisite, war-winning instruments of precision destruction. The 240mm was not a weapon of quantity, but one of overwhelming qualitative impact at the critical point. When Germany's unconditional surrender finally came, it was the culmination of efforts on all fronts. But on the Western Front, the 240mm howitzer had written its own signature on the final chapter. It was their weapon that had answered the concrete challenge of the Atlantic Wall, broken the stalemate in the blockage, shattered the Siegfried Line, and pulverized the final urban redoubts of the Reich. It had saved countless American infantry lives by solving tactical problems that would have otherwise required bloody frontal assaults. It had not just supported the advance, it had enabled it, clearing the most formidable physical and psychological obstacles in the path to victory. The 240mm howitzer M1, the concrete cracker, had earned its title as the King of Battle, a monarch whose rule was absolute and whose judgment, delivered in 360 pounds of high-explosive steel, was final.